Hi Class T, it's that time again, and today we're going to be reading chapters 13 to 16, so it's 4 chapters today. So, I wonder what's going to happen now. Mrs. Twit has landed back on the ground. Or maybe she's not landed yet. We'll have to see what happens. Mr. Twit gets a horrid shock. Mr. Twit, who thought he'd seen his ugly wife for the last time, was sitting in the garden celebrating with a mug of beer. Silently, Mrs. Twit came floating down. When she was about the height of the house, Mr. Twit, she suddenly called out at the top of her voice, "Here I come, you grizzly old grunion! You rotten old turnip! You filthy old frumpet!" Mr. Twit jumped as though he'd been stung by a giant wasp. He dropped his beer. He looked up. He gaped. He gasped. He gurgled. A few choking sounds came out of his mouth. He said, ow! "I'll get you for this!" shouted Mrs. Twit. She was floating down right on top of him. She was purple with rage and slashing the air with her long walking stick, which she had somehow managed to hang on to all the time. "I'll swish you to a swazzle," she shouted. "I'll swash you to a swizzle. I'll gnash you to a gnozzle. I'll gnosh you to a gnazzle." And before Mr. Twit had time to run away, this bundle of balloons and petticoats and fiery fury landed right on top of him, lashing out with the stick and cracking him all over his body. Chapter 14. The House, the Tree, and the Monkey Cage. But that's enough of that. We can't go on forever, watching these two disgusting people doing disgusting things to each other. We must get ahead with the story. Here's a picture of Mr. and Mrs. Twit's house and garden. Some house. It looks like a prison, and not a window anywhere. "Who wants windows?" Mr. Twit had said when they were building it. "Who wants every Tom, Dick and Harry peeping in to see what you're doing?" It didn't occur to Mr. Twit that windows were meant mainly for looking out of, not for looking into. And what do you think of that ghastly garden? Mrs. Twit was the gardener. She was very good at growing thistles and stinging nettles. "I always grow plenty of spiky thistles and plenty of stinging nettles," she used to say. "They keep out nasty, nosy little children." Near the house, you can see Mr. Twit's workshed. The one side, there is a big, dead tree. It never has any leaves on it because it's dead. And not far from the tree, you can see the monkey cage. There are 4 monkeys in it. They belong to Mr. Twit. You'll hear about them later. Chapter 15. Hung tight, sticky glue. Once a week, on Wednesdays, the Twits had bird pie for supper. Mr. Twit caught the birds, and Mrs. Twit cooked them. Mr. Twit was good at catching birds. On the day before Bird Pie Day, he would put the ladder up against the big, dead tree and climb into the branches with a bucket of glue and a paintbrush. The glue he used was something called Hung Tight, and it was stickier than any other glue in the world. He would paint it along the tops of all the branches and then go away. as the sun went down, birds would fly in from all around to roost for the night in the big dead tree. They didn't know, poor things, that the branches were all smeared with horrible hungtite. The moment they landed on a branch, their feet stuck, and that was that. The next morning, which was bird pie day, Mr. Twit would climb up the ladder again and grab all the wretched birds that were stuck to the tree. It didn't matter what kind they were. Song thrushes, blackbirds, sparrows, crows, little jenny wrens, robins, anything. They all went into the pot for Wednesday's bird pie supper. Chapter 16. 4 sticky little boys. On one Tuesday evening, after Mr. Twit had been up the ladder and smeared the tree with hungtite, 4 little boys crept into the garden to look at the monkeys. They didn't care about the thistles and the stinging nettles. Not when there were monkeys to look at. After a while, they got tired of looking at the monkeys. So they explored further into the garden and found the ladder leaning against the big dead tree. They decided to climb up it just for fun. There's nothing wrong with that. The next morning, when Mr. Twit went out to collect the birds, he found 4 miserable little boys sitting in the tree, stuck as tight as could be by the seats of their pants to the branches. There were no birds because the presence of the boys had scared them away. Mr. Twit was furious. "As there are no birds for my pie tonight," he shouted, "then it'll have to be boys instead." He started to climb the ladder. "Boy pie might be better than bird pie," he went on, grinning horribly. "More meat and not so many tiny little bones." The boys were terrified. "He's going to boil us!" cried one of them. "He'll stew us alive!" wailed the second one. "He'll cook us with carrots!" cried the third. But the 4th little boy, who had more sense than the others, whispered, "Listen, I've just had an idea. We're only stuck by the seats of our pants. So quick, unbutton your pants and slip out of them and fall to the ground." Mr. Twit had reached the top of the ladder and was just about to make a grab for the nearest boy when they all suddenly tumbled out of the tree and ran for home with their naked bottoms winking at the sun. And that's the end of today's story. I hope you've enjoyed that. Keep safe and keep washing those hands.